The first thing Russians do in territories they've conquered is to take over the media, television, newspapers, and the internet. That's no coincidence. Propaganda is crucial to brainwash enough of the population to prevent revolts and to terrorize the rest into indifference and silence. Today, I'm looking at the role of a resilient media in countering Russian disinformation and aggression. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. It will really help to increase the popularity of our content in YouTube's algorithms. The material is now being made also available on podcasting platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Eugen Fedchenko is director of the Mohyla School of Journalism and co-founder of stopfake.org. He is also former Fulbright professor at USC Annenberg. The Mohyla School of Journalism was created on a completely new basis, different from other Ukrainian schools. It was not a continuation of tradition, but designed to take the best ideas and techniques from around the world. The goal of the school is to produce people who will change Ukrainian journalism and help its transition as an ex-Soviet state into a pluralistic and democratic society. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And I'd like to start really with current events and, of course, the death of the first and last president of the Soviet Union. Now, he will not be mourned in Russia as much as he is in the West, of course, for his role in the breakup of the Soviet Union. But do Ukrainians have a different perspective on Mikhail Gorbachev and his legacy?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, but in Ukraine, probably he also is not mourned a lot for different reasons. In Russia, because they consider he was not enough imperialist, and in Ukraine, because we consider him to be still a Soviet imperialist, but not very successful, or imperialist that failed, so to say. And that would be the main reason. Even some people might say that it was after his presidency when Ukraine received its independence. But we look differently because we actually feel that Ukraine renewed its independence after Soviet occupation. And so for many of us here, he would be the last president of an occupying power. And that's an attitude. Even though I was watching yesterday documentary by Mansky, which was done not long before he died, and in many places through all the documentary, Gorbachev is either singing songs in Ukrainian or he's just speaking in Ukrainian. And I'm even not sure if he realized that for himself, or is it kind of subconscious movements, but to some extent, it was obvious that he was a product of this empire, including he was always insisting and emphasizing his Ukrainian origin. And of course, that would be another reason for some Russian chauvinists who would say, oh, he was not enough Russian, and that's why he broke up the Soviet Union, because he was Ukrainian, So for them, he would be too Ukrainian, and for Ukrainians, he would be not enough Ukrainian, who was not sympathizing with what was happening in Ukraine in those years. And to big extent, he was complaining all the time that he had so many ideas how to preserve the Soviet Union, but the local elites in Baltic states, in Ukraine, were always on his way to conduct those reforms. And he was referring to that all the time. So he was unhappy with what was happening at the periphery of the Soviet Empire. And he was considering that they were creating a lot of obstacles, and local elites prevented him from from reforming Soviet Union into what he wanted to see. But that probably describes the attitude. And for many people in Ukraine, it was kind of also the kind of omen that while Ukraine is fighting this war of independence, which was probably a little bit put off in space and time from 1991. So we are fighting it right now. And because Gorbachev is dying right now, just another sign that the Soviet Empire is basically dying as a concept.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting, I was speaking yesterday to a historian, and he made the point that, you know, the decolonization of the British Empire was varying success. You know, it was met with a lot of chaos. There was a lot of bloodshed, actually, and issues. But decolonization was a conscious decision to go down that path. You know, whether it was implemented well or not is another question. But the decolonization of Eastern Europe was not a conscious choice made on the part of the Russian leadership. It was an accident of history, a sort of tide that they rose and could do nothing about. And the first time that Russia had the material to try and reverse that under Putin, that's exactly what he's tried to do, is to reverse that accidental collapse of empire.
Yeah, and actually you would never find, for example, Gorbachev using even the concept of decolonization. It was not a part of his vision of the world. And also referring back to this Mansky documentary, he was insistently asking him, so how did you want to give more freedom to people in Baltic states, for example, and still reshape and preserve the Soviet Union? That's impossible, because these two scenes are opposite in results and in the vision. And Gorbachev said, for me, it's a conflict for you, he said, referring to director, but not for me. So he didn't see even there's a conflict in this. And this was one of his biggest problems, because again, for people in the West, he's considered to be a big liberator who led the Eastern Europe to be free. It's not like that. Actually, Eastern Europe was fighting to be free, and he was trying to prevent it to become free. And we've seen the bloodshed in Baltic states, in Baku, in Tbilisi. It did not happen in Ukraine, but again, it was just delayed. That's exactly what we are dealing with now. And that's exactly because Russia was never also taking decolonization as a kind of serious concept to live through intellectually and politically. And of course, you would not find it this concept fitting well either into current political regime in Russia, of course, but also into many or most so-called liberal minds of Russian intellectuals living either in Russia or even living abroad for many, many years. They still consider that there is no need for any decolonization of the political discourse in Russia. And of course, there is no need to change the practices of how Russia is dealing with other former parts of the colonies, with former colonies. So, and this is one of the reasons actually for this current war. As I said, it was delayed, it was postponed, but if we would look into the kind of collective psyche of Russian people, you still would find that they are fighting the imperial war, even if they do not recognize it.
Mm-hmm. And the timing is not coincidental either, is it? Because whereas the propaganda narrative says this is all the fault of NATO, etc., 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 there's a much more interesting trend, isn't there, taking place, which is that last year, Ukraine was set for the first time ever to exceed the average earnings. So what you're seeing here is, despite its sort of chaotic and sometimes quite frightening sort of political changes that are taking place, certainly frightening for Russians who don't seem to sort of be able to handle that kind of chaos and complexity. They love the narrative that Ukraine was a failed state, that economically their stability, their form of totalitarian rule, at least provided some kind of economic benefit. But last year, reality was set to overtake that and show that actually that sort of messy democratic evolution also produced a richer, materially richer society.
Yeah, I think it was actually one of the biggest reasons for this war. And if we would go back now to period of February and March, to all these famous memes with Ukrainian tractors fighting back and pulling Russian military equipment, and Russian military personnel stealing washing machines. So that's basically about what Russia was, how Russia was angry about what Ukrainians achieved, because as many Russian military confessed in those conversations we've been listening to, they never witnessed that level of economic prosperity back home. They've never seen, for example, Western-produced tractors which Ukrainian farmers were using to pull Russian tanks away. So for them it was looking absolutely miraculously something from another life, and then it might be compared to the shock of the Soviet military, which was liberating, occupying Berlin, for example, because they also, what they've seen was incompatible with what propaganda was saying to them, because propaganda was portraying both Berlin and Ukraine as something which, was absolutely ruined by fascists, real fascists in Berlin, and fascists they invented in Ukraine. And then their first-hand experience was completely different, and then made them absolutely not only unhappy about what they've seen, but also revengeous about that. And partly why they started to kill people, because they hated them for this very reason, because these people were living better than them. And that was, again, unacceptable for representatives of former metropolia who are expected to live better than people living in the periphery of the empire. So here we come back to that kind of big ideological constructs. And also, even generally speaking, we would notice how history was central to building this momentum for Russia starting incursion for Ukraine. So Putin was writing his essays, famous so-called historical essays, explaining that Ukraine never existed, that Ukraine was created by Lenin, or that Ukraine was always a kind of hinterland of Russia, actually, that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. So all his kind of intellectual activities, if we might say it so, they were concentrated around explaining to himself that there is no any Ukraine around. This is just a different type of Russia. And I'm absolutely sure that he believes what he's saying. That's not like old Soviet kind of cynical approach to propaganda, which was very widespread back into the last years of the Soviet Union, when people were listening to all that, and that was in my family, in many other families, and they just, made fun of that. And, all these anecdotes about secretaries general who were dying one after another, they became a part of the folklore. So nobody was taking already that, and it was a more fun, that kind of the serious perception. There was no any kind of the ideological bubble. And yes, back then we had a deficit of information, but we had plenty of a rational understanding of the world around us, even when we were children at that point, And now we see completely different situation when Russians has access to any kind of information. Everything is open. You don't need to kind of secretly listening to the BBC World Service to get the latest news, but they just don't care about what they hear or what they read, because they already have their perception how the world should be constructed and adjusted to their expectations. And
so what's happened? I mean, so the propaganda techniques that we're seeing, the narratives that we're seeing, they not only work or did work in Ukraine, they also work in other countries, Italy, Hungary, Serbia, the Middle East, Africa. We see different approaches in different countries, but unlike the Soviet propaganda, which, as you say, nobody believed by the end, there is a lot of belief and acceptance in the various narratives that are being pumped out. So what's the role of journalism in trying to immunize people against this toxic propaganda?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, you're right, because to big extent, Russian disinformation is constructed in the same way as Ukraine, as a Soviet disinformation, and I've been doing research of this, and I have found a lot of similarities in approaches and narratives. For example, the narrative I mentioned about Ukrainian as fascist is not new, so it was used in Soviet historiography very effectively as well. But what was different, that disinformation is successful when it falls on the kind of prepared ground, so to say, when people hear what they actually want to hear. And also another reason for people taking seriously Russia and Russian disinformation was that people started to cultivate this kind of very rational approach to Russia, like there is no more Soviet Union, so there is no this kind of ideological disinformation and other things. So now the world is immune to all this. So everything which is happening since that moment, since the fall of Berlin Wall and breakup of the Soviet Union, is, so we start everything from the scratch, and that's completely different Russia. So it's very rational, money oriented, and that increased the trust, actually. And because people trusted to Russia, because they wanted to trust, because to some extent they during Soviet years they were quite afraid because of the dangers of potential nuclear war and the war in Western Europe and other things. And then when the Soviet Union disappeared, they said, oh, great, there is no more danger. So we should relax, we should start thinking about, liberal economies. And Russia is a part of this liberal economy. We should make it a part of it. We should interconnect it. And then there would be no problem to dealing with them. And also there was another problem, because a lot of diplomats and statesmen, those who participated in all these negotiations at the very last stage of Soviet Union, they also been considering that to be very rational. We've always seen the word negotiations. We've been negotiated with the Soviet Union and agrees on that and that and that. And it's absolutely baseless. It's pointless, because at that moment, Soviet Union was at the state when they could not negotiate anything. They ran out of any resources, and so they cannot come to these negotiations with any kind of high stakes, and that explained everything. So they gave up nuclear weapons or biological weapons. They did not do that, but they promised to do that because they just didn't have another political option at that moment. And also they just needed money from United States, from Germany, and they basically sold the opportunity to unite Germany to German people and to break up the Berlin Wall. So it was not a political movement. It was not a kind of gesture of a goodwill coming from Gorbachev. And then everybody was very grateful, and Germany was saying, "Oh, danke, Gorby, great job, thank you so much." And so it was absolutely wrong assessment of how it happened and why it happened. And now in the West, people just do not remember how it was happening. And as a Soviet kid, I do remember there was nothing to eat in the Soviet Union. And that's why the Gorbachev approach to dealing with the West was like it was. Because, of course, it would be completely different if the Soviet Union would have additional resources to continue the Cold War and continue the evil empire behavior and other things. They just ran out of resources. And so they wanted to buy those resources from the West. And that's exactly what happened subsequently. So the West was subsidizing the growth of Russian revanchism. And yes, they became a part of this kind of globalized economic system, but with their own reasoning. They wanted to use the money and resources from the West and the atmosphere of political openness, not to become a part of this, but to deceive, basically, to use this kind of bad Soviet Union versus good Soviet Union approach, to throw some big scenes like perestroika, glasnost, and everybody was happy with that. Oh, it's a new thing, and everything changes. Forget the Cold War. It's all the ideas from the past. Now everything would be different. And for Russia, it was not different.
It's
and
marketing,
that's why,
basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's why Putin became a president.
Yes. And there's another big difference.
They did not want to be different. They just wanted to use this opportunity to have some kind of a period to relax and beef up resources, and then to attack the West, but from the completely different positions.
And of course, I think something that's not that well understood is that the key differences between Ukraine since 1991 and Russia is that both societies started building some of the institutions for civil society. That process has actually accelerated in Ukraine, but in Russia, the process of building the foundations of civil society, reforming the courts, the law, the executive, that process actually went into reverse in the 2000s. And from about 2012 onwards, one by one, all those institutions of civil society have actually been threatened or shut down. So could you describe a little bit about your thoughts on the differences of those two trajectories of the evolution of civil society?
Yeah, absolutely. So it took two completely different paths. And as a journalist, I was witnessing, for example, how the media segment of civil society was growing in Ukraine. It was absolutely small compared to Russia in terms of the number of media outlets and number of journalists and amount of money also the Western donors invested in the development. So it was two completely different stories. And Russia was at the end of 1990s, at the beginning of 2000, was boasting how powerful journalism they have, because they inherited this tradition from the Soviet system, and then they improved it. And that was, again, the key problem with that, because you cannot improve the Soviet institutions. You need to kill them completely. You need to get rid of all those people who were running those institutions, and you need to start from the scratch. And that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. So in Ukraine in 1990s, the journalism was very young, very energetic. We had very, very few people inherited from the Soviet system. So we were not reforming it. We were building it from the scratch. For example, I was working for Internews, and we started the first non-governmental news service in Ukraine. And when we entered the newsroom, my first question was, what kind of the editorial rules here are? And I was said, you can do whatever you wish, you know. So that was the frames of my liberty. I can look at the journalistic profession as a kind of endless possibilities to tell the truth to people. And even at some point, I remember my colleagues were going to Moscow to kind of learn from their kind of, it was called senior colleagues, senior partners, like from stations like NTV, which was very progressive, very aggressive with, keeping their fingers in the Russian political process, and with, Gusinsky as a kingmaker and Berezovsky. It was very, very kind of dynamic environment. And they were teaching my colleagues, how to do journalism. And the irony was that all those people who were sharing their knowledge and experience with us then became the best servants of Putin's disinformation. So if you remember, the first thing what Putin did was to make NTV completely different, to take it away from oligarchs and make it quasi-state news service. So it was his basically the first public step, and it was very, very kind of self-explanatory, because he saw them as the biggest obstacle for him to usurpate power at the later stages. And all those people who then went to this meeting, his first meeting with journalists, NTV journalists, all of them, except very few, became the cornerstone of his propaganda machine, which means they were never kind of authentic in their desire to build something completely different, not to continue with Soviet journalism and propaganda, but to be independent, real journalists. So for them, it was, as for Soviet Union, there was some period to have rest, and to get resources and to change, the old Soviet, unacceptable ideological shores for something, looking completely different, but being absolutely the same in terms of the content of this concept, And that's what happened to many other areas. And again, as I said, Western donors were happy to, invest a lot of monies into different institutions and reforming and believing that this is the center we need to work with. And people in Ukraine or in Baltic states, it's a kind of minor periphery. So everything important is happening in Moscow. So we need to be there. And that, then kind of brought the whole generations of Western media attention to the Moscow as a kind of center of everything in the post-Soviet space. Foreign journalists who made their careers working out of Moscow, and sometimes kind of describing Ukraine as some peripheric, people, funny people, trying to speak their own language, and all this.
And of course, that will affect how journalists see the world, even if they're trying to be objective, even if they're trying to understand what's going on. If they only talk to Russians and they live and exist in an intellectual sphere, they may be trying to purge their thinking of all those imperial ideas. But it's almost impossible to report on Ukrainian events or events on the periphery if you've got that sort of Moscow lens, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And those attitudes were continuing well into 2022. You know, it even did not end in 2014 when the war started. So for us, the war did not start this February. For us, the war started back in 2014. So we are fighting it already for 8 years. But for many journalists, it did not make any difference, and they still were considering that Moscow is important. For this as a place, as a vantage point from where to look at what is happening. And of course, as you said, the intellectual kind of environment was defining how they write about this, how they report about this. And also it was all very, even if we talk about relatively young people, young journalists, they were very, how to put it, Soviet-centric, I would say. So they were still looking at this from very kind of Soviet perspective. I remember a lot of Moscow-based journalists were very nostalgic about Soviet trains, for example, or how we can take this, you know, Platzkart open train, you know, and then travel around Russia. And so, for example, they were very nostalgic when Russian railway said we discontinue those carriages, you know, old Soviet carriages. Oh, it was so nostalgic, you know, and many other things. So it was very kind of Soviet at its core. And it continued what I call Duranty tradition of reporting Ukraine. I mean, the journalist from the New York Times who was covering famine in Ukraine in 1930s from Moscow and basically denying that it's happening. And to some extent, I could see the continuation of this, you know, tradition. And I've noticed how some journalists are just making, you know, their careers, you know, writing books and doing some, you know, academic careers around this, just because this is a mainstream. So Ukraine was not a part, was never a part of this mainstream. It was always kind of a marginal, and yeah, sometimes they took travel to Kiev, and they always said, oh, it's such a great atmosphere over there. It's a kind of a very south feeling place, you know, it's like Odessa and all this. But it's also very imperial kind of attitude, because it's like, you know, go from the north to the south, you know, and it's all, everybody is relaxed, and it's you know, this, you know, Russian Empire architecture around, and everything is so familiar from books, you know, from Russian classical music. So it's all about great culture, and some small annoying Ukraine, you know, which is basically somewhere on the way of the normal relationships, you know. So, and this was kind of ennui of Ukraine and annoyance of Ukraine, which was actually preventing to look at this with kind of eyes wide open.
And literature is the same. Literature and history is the same, isn't it? It's the
absolutely. So only now we see how the world is kind of discovering, oh, Ukraine has some, you know, books even around, you know, oh, and Ukraine had some composers who might think, you know, who might thought, you know, that, yeah, there might be composers in Ukraine, because we thought that Ukraine is about peasants, you know, and about, you know, waiters at nice restaurants, and here you can open some culture. And so that's what the war changes. But unfortunately, the price we are paying for this is very high. To map finally Ukraine as a country, we need to survive through this war, and people are paying with their lives to compensate this ignorance, which was around for years and years. So again, as I said, for many people, Soviet Union never collapsed, never disappeared. It just, you know, changed the form and the name. And some of the people were just looking at this as most Russians are doing, as some kind of temporal arrangement, like, well, Ukraine wants to play this independence game. Okay, we can wait, you know, and But sooner or later, the things would be okay again. So, and this approach was very, very widespread.
And talking of that, of course, I mean, Ukraine did not move back into the Russian sphere. In fact, it's moving further and further away. And the election of Zelensky pushed it far further away from the Ruski Mir than before. So when it comes to the two projects you're involved in, which is the School of Journalism and StopFake.org, let's start with the School of Journalism. If Moscow cannot be a template for how you educate and build that, do you look to other Western countries as a sort of template for the development of your journalistic education, or are you trying to create something unique for Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely right. So when we created the school, and we created it from the scratch, the idea was that we need to get rid of everything Soviet, from all this heritage of journalism education as actually preparing people to participate in propaganda, or just some literature, because that was kind of two ends of this spectrum. If you do not want to participate in propaganda, then you can find your kind of your seclusion at some kind of literature activities, and then using the Zop language, you can, try to say a truth. So we said, okay, we don't need that. We want to throw away all the kind of Soviet heritage of journalism, literature, everything, and build something completely different, looking, of course, at the existent models of how journalism is taught. So, of course, it was not about inventing bicycles, because everything is already invented. You just need to look in different places. And we've been talking to our colleagues in many parts of the world. From Leeds University, we invited them to come to help to start the school. We've been looking into Columbia School of Journalism. We invited people from all over the world to come and teach and bring pieces of very different systems of teaching journalism, because it's different everywhere, but we wanted to find out what would be the most suitable model. And also it's always about kind of showing the model, so what we want to get at the end. So when we explain to students, look, this is a piece of great journalism where we are going, we've never been using any Russian media, of course, because we did not consider them to be a place where you can find the real journalism. So it was always my opinion, even if some people were saying, oh, but of course in Russia you can find Medusa and you can find Dozhd. So for me, both Medusa and Dozhd are just continuation of the Soviet journalism. It might look a little bit funny and more vibrant, but in terms of their ideology and how, including how they present news about Ukraine, for me, they are the part of the same pattern. And that's why we never would be using any examples from that. And also my point was that media system in Russia would be dying. And I said about that years ago. And then I had a lot of, fun and smiles coming from all parts and saying, well, that's again this Ukrainian chauvinism, nationalism, because in Russia you can find a lot of great journalism. But the problem is that now in Russia you cannot find any journalism, neither good or bad journalism. You can either find Russian propaganda, which is absolutely kind of a huge bubble, which is absolutely
Russian journalists are either good journalists are either dead,
some
or
Russian journalists living and working abroad, but they have nothing to do with Russia. Yes. They are not talking to any audiences back in Russia. So that's why they are completely irrelevant, and they can do absolutely marvelous things. If they do not do that. But media is always about audiences to whom they talk. So I don't know to whom they talk working in Riga, in Paris or Prague, anywhere. I don't see their audiences, because their audiences are living in Russia and they are watching Russian television, and they support war against Ukraine as the biggest result of this, as they support Putin. They support existing political regime. and they are co-participants of this war.
Mm-hmm.
And so definitely from the point of view of building some model for School of Journalism, we've been looking somewhere else for inspiration and for models, and definitely we have found plenty of great people, great examples, and we also have a lot of great alumni since the beginning of the creation of the schools. They are now working everywhere, and this is very special for me, because now when I see who is covering this war, it's covered by young people who graduated from places like my school, who are never related to anything Soviet, anything Russian. They've never been watching Russian television or any other type of television already, and they're completely different people. Their minds are wired in a very, very different way. And that's exactly what we needed. So that's about the generation, even not generation gap, but generation changes, So we've seen how very different generation of people came to do journalism, and that completely changed the whole journalistic profession in Ukraine. It's absolutely unresembling anything you can now find in Russia, or you could find in Russia 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's absolutely different, and it's great.
And of course, many people, especially the generation you talk about, would have potentially taken their statehood, their independence of Ukraine for granted, because they were born into an independent country. But everyone since 2014 has really come to, I think, appreciate and understand what that freedom really means in a way that probably Western Europe has not yet realized.
Yeah, and I think it's another big difference with Russia, because over there we see how a lot of people who never witnessed Soviet Union are supportive of Soviet Union, Stalin, his purges, and all the things they've never witnessed. And in Ukraine, it's completely different, because the new generation, even if they've never witnessed Soviet Union firsthand, they are not only not supporting this, but they are complete opponents of this. They do not accept it from ontological point of view. They are absolutely opposite to this. And even if they've never been beyond reality of have Ukraine as their country around them, they are fighting now because they not because they know that it can be different, and there were periods when Ukraine was not there, but just because that's the only value they would love to support.
And the other thing, coming back to what you mentioned about NTV, the journalists, of course, a few were kicked out. I think Dmitry Kisilov, and there are a few others who left and to an extent sort of preserved their reputations, but most stayed. The other thing that was closed down, of course, was satire. And one of the first things Putin made sure didn't carry on was satirical television, satirical shows, satirical journalism. Is there a big difference in Ukraine there as well? Has that sphere of creativity increased and done well over the last 30 years?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's probably one of the biggest difference if we would compare, for example, now and back in 2014 and earlier years. It's a huge uptick in humor, in memes, so it's not only about the creativity, it's about very different approach to the perception of the reality, and that's about free people, so they can die for this system if they wish, defending their country on the war, or they can laugh about something which is laughable from their point of view, or they can criticize their government and make memes about them, or they can throw this government if they do not consider it to be relevant anymore. What else can be called freedom?
Absolutely. My last question really relates to the other area of your activity, and that is stopfake.org. Can you describe a little bit the origins of that project, what it does, how it works, and how does it counter the narratives of propaganda?
Yeah, so we started Stop Fake back in 2014. And for us, as I said, that was one of the key dates on a calendar, because that was the beginning of this war. And when the war started, we realized that disinformation is integral part of this war. So probably at that point, we did not look at it as a hybrid warfare or cognitive warfare or as a kind of big concept which can be borrowed from military studies. But we were looking at it from journalistic point of view, because we realized that on one hand, there is not much Ukrainian information, because Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian media were not prepared for this war. And on the other hand, Russians, realizing that there is this vacuum of information, they were trying to accumulate as much as possible of disinformation and propaganda over there. And it was obvious for us. So as observers of this media space, it was immediately obvious that if we do not do something very, very quickly, that might be a huge issue, which would jeopardize even our kind of existential being, And that's how we started Stop Fake, to use fact-checking as a tool to fight disinformation. So we look at every separate piece of information coming from Russia through monitoring. And if we find it not to be true, we write the explanation why it's not true, and then try to disseminate to as many people as possible using social media, television, any other channels which we might find, including offline lectures and workshops and other things. So it was about two things. First, very tactical, how to stop disinformation right now, and a more long-term objective, how to educate people that not all news or not everything they consume from media ecosystem is actually the real news. And at that point, it was a big challenge, because people were taking everything for granted. And as the beginning, we said that about people in the West and in many other areas, that they were taking for granted everything which was coming from Russia. And the case was with Ukraine as well. So people here were also taken at face value everything they've heard or watched, and all Russian TV channels were fully present in Ukraine at that moment. All social media like VK and Odnoklassniki. So Russia had developed multiple platforms and entry points to Ukrainian media users. And the idea was that we need to understand how big the system is, how it works, to map the main players and try to do something about those influences. And I think we were very, very successful. And we came to this February well prepared. We already had complete understanding what we are fighting with. We had complete understanding who the midline actors are on the Russian side. We also had a great team of people. We had a methodology developed. We had big audiences on social media. And we had also a lot of partners in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, who also participated in all this. And also Russian media were absolutely discredited by 2022 because they were lying constantly. So it was just a question of time when people would just stop buying what they want to sell to them, And I think February became kind of a threshold for those people who still were hesitating, For most of them, it was a kind of eye-opening moment, and they changed their opinion. But till February, of course, still were a lot of whom we might call Putin verstehers, and those people, again, as I said, who were looking at Ukraine as some kind of annoyance, which was an obstacle to better relations between the West and Russia. They are still around, some of them, and now I see their voices again become more more heard. So
Yes.
they're not keeping a low profile anymore as it was back in February. And of course, Russia is exploiting those voices for their own benefits, to explain why not to support Ukraine, why to not to trust Ukrainians, and so basically they are trying to again to eliminate Ukraine from the political map by using very different instruments like sowing doubts about Ukraine.
And they'll use gas as well, gas, food.
Yeah,
Try
absolutely.
and get the West to be selfish.
Yeah, absolutely. So they just trying to explain to people that now they need not to support Russia and what Russia is doing, but they just need not to support Ukraine because that would influence their personal well-being, their, profits of their companies and the temperatures in their apartments and other things. So it's basically about blackmail. And that's exactly what we've been discussing at the very beginning, that the West did not understand the real intentions of Soviet Union. And it's just the continuation of the same game. The stakes are the same. So Russia just wants to preserve its influence by any price. It's not about Ukraine, by the way, from Russian point of view. It's about the influence. They want to have their influence as a final kind of objective of this war. They want to influence Western Europe, they want to influence United States, and they want to influence public opinion in the global South. So they are not even hiding that. They are openly speaking about this, and they would be using all instruments, including blackmail, as was said. And that would be more and more obvious the closer we come to winter. So it's not about some big issues like, Ukraine and Lenin, it's not about NATO expansion. It's about preserving this influence. And also, I'm afraid that they would try to use the same trick as it was used with, Gorbachev and perestroika. So they would create the crisis, and they then would, offer some person less evil than Putin. And
this whole cycle begins again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going in circles. It's nothing new. I mean, from my point of view, I do not, it's very hard to surprise me, and I do not see anything new in this kind of political configuration. So they would come with something less evil, with someone a little bit more acceptable for the West, and the West would be happy and say, "Oh, we enter in the new period of our relations, in new Russia. Everything changes, and Ukraine is not important anymore again, because we have this kind of main." As it can be compared with kind of main adversarial, so it's a main partner,
Yeah. But what has changed? I mean, what has changed is these techniques and the knowledge that you're talking about in Ukraine. So is there a role now for Ukraine to become an exporter of knowledge and counter-propaganda techniques to the West?
Yeah, so of course Ukraine is building its kind of subjectivity and its role, and so more and more people now are not looking at Ukraine through Russian prism, but through kind of independent prism for Ukraine, But it doesn't mean that Russia is disappearing. I mean, this optics is still there, and it's still very, very dangerous. And again, I'm afraid that those things which are obvious for people who've been kind of observing Soviet Union, people in Baltic states, in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Slovakia. It's obvious for us, but very often it's not obvious for the West. And they are still cannot comprise what kind of game Russia is playing, and they are still rationalizing and looking at this from very rational point of view. But that's completely wrong approach to evaluate this situation, and I'm afraid they just can get into this trap again.
I think that really underlines the importance of the work you're doing, and I think we could almost certainly talk for hours and hours, but I think we've probably reached the end of this segment. It's extremely interesting, and the work you're doing is extraordinary. I really hope to get the chance, that we get to speak again, and of course, I hope that victory comes sooner rather than later. So thank you so very much again
Thanks
for
again.
speaking to me. Huge
Yeah, it's a
pleasure.
great pleasure.
And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.